Hello everyone, my name is Tom Yamashita and welcome to my presentation on quantifying the vegetation structure around wildlife crossing structures in Cameron County, Texas. So starting with an outline of my presentation, do some introduction, objectives, then study area, then we're going to talk about some landscape metrics and bobcat crossing use, and end with some discussion and some ongoing research. So to start off, wildlife crossings are often built for specific target species based on road mortality locations or land cover immediately around the site. However, this could neglect whether the location with a crossing could support an individual living around that structure. So additional factors, including broader scale land cover, may be important for determining wildlife crossing use. Wildlife crossings in South Texas are being built to reduce ocelot road mortalities, and the majority of these road mortalities are thought to be dispersing males. However, wildlife crossings are novel structures, so may be less likely to be used by a dispersing individual who has only seen a structure one time. Therefore, resident animals are more likely to be the ones using wildlife crossings. So it is important to examine how land cover on a broader scale affects crossing use. Resident individuals are likely to pick their home ranges based on the surrounding land cover more than the presence of a wildlife crossing. Wildlife crossings also benefit more than just the target species, and unfortunately, ocelot crossing events are rare, so we focused our research on bobcats, which is an ecologically similar but sympatric felid to ocelots. The objectives for this study were to characterize the landscape structure around wildlife crossings and future wildlife crossing locations in South Texas, and then compare this to available habitat to see how crossing structure landscapes differ from available. And then also we wanted to look at how bobcat use varies with landscape metrics at each wildlife crossing location. Starting with our study area, we focused on 3 highways in South Texas where wildlife crossing structures have been built or are being built. These were State Highway 100, where 5 crossings were completed in 2018, Farm to Market 106, where 10 crossings were completed in 2019, and then Farm to Market 1847, where 5 crossings are currently under construction and are expected to be completed in 2022. So our study area includes several different land cover types, including urban areas, agriculture, rangelands, and the National Wildlife Refuge. So the landscape is highly complex, and this complexity could really impact crossing use at different sites. Additionally, due to the proximity of some of the crossing structures, so some were very close to each other, we ended up combining them into single sites, and we chose an equal number of random locations as available land cover sites for comparison. So first, we classified a 2016 National Agricultural Imagery Program aerial image with a 1 meter pixel resolution using supervised classification with a random forest model in ArcGIS Pro. We then manually digitized agricultural areas and identified urban areas using aerial LiDAR and a Texas Department of Transportation road database. We combined our classified map with our manually classified classes to have a final map with 6 classes: bare, herbaceous, water, woody, agriculture, and urban. We then created 1 kilometer buffers around each of our sites, those are crossing and random sites, and calculated landscape metrics as measures of landscape structure around each site using frag stats for each land cover class. So we also monitored each wildlife crossing location and future wildlife crossing location using camera traps for bobcats, ocelots, and other medium to large size mammals. We had between 4 and 10 cameras set up at each site in order to ensure that we captured use at the crossing. At completed crossing sites, we used an active infrared trigger system to better capture animals entering and exiting the crossing. So because these crossings were built at different times, they were completed 2018, 2019, and some are still in progress, we used data only at times when monitoring was occurring at all crossings at the same time. So this was December of 2019 to November of 2020. We realized that this could be biased due to time since crossing completed, but since we have crossings in different stages of use, that is important. We then used a 30-minute interval to define independent events for use at each crossing. So for our statistical analyses, first we wanted to compare woody cover, the structure of the woody cover around wildlife crossings to the available habitat. So we used a permanova so that we could assess landscape structure as a whole rather than how individual metrics differed. We then used a PCA to visualize differences between crossing and random sites and how individual metrics contributed to that variation between sites. Next, we used a generalized linear mixed model with a negative binomial distribution to assess how monthly bobcat use of wildlife crossings and future wildlife crossing sites was related to landscape metrics. In our model, landscape metrics were fixed effects, while month and crossing were random effects. So on to our results, starting with the landscape structure comparison. We found no significant differences in the woody cover structure at wildlife crossings and random sites. Additionally, while these results were not significant, we were still able to visualize how metrics varied among sites. Generally, crossing sites had smaller, more regularly shaped patches that were further apart. Moving on to our bobcat crossings and lands. We found that bobcat crossing use was positively associated with mean patch area and landscape shape index, and negatively associated with aggregation index. So, which is different than what differed at wildlife crossings from random sites. So on to our discussion, starting with landscape structure. We found that landscape structure was not different at crossings compared to available habitat, indicating that these locations were not necessarily special to what is available in the surrounding habitat. So in some ways, this is a good thing because now animals don't necessarily have a reason to avoid these locations. However, it also means that the habitat is not necessarily more favorable and won't attract animals either. So therefore, road effects, such as those effects from light pollution, noise pollution, and just the mere presence of vehicles on the road could be very important and something that we will need to consider in future work. We also found that bobcats seem to prefer crossings with larger patches of woody cover that are more irregularly shaped and more spread out. And this is interesting because bobcats in South Texas have been shown to have a preference for woody cover. So you would expect them to want to have not only more woody cover, but also larger patches that were closer together. This research is still in progress. We're still working on including additional variables. The main one that we want to include is LiDAR data so that we can examine how the density of the vegetation or the thickness or horizontal cover, depending on what language you want to use, compares at crossings to available sites, and as well as how this could affect bobcat crossing use. It's very possible that bobcats are preferring patches that have very thick understories. So we want to assess how the thickness of the vegetation could impact crossings. We then want to apply this model to US Highway 77, where TxDOT is planning several more wildlife crossings for ocelots, bobcats, and other mammals. And with that, I'd like to thank the Cesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute for supporting my research, Texas Department of Transportation for funding this work, US Fish and Wildlife for allowing land access, as well as all the graduate students, undergraduates, and research assistants who collected and processed all of the camera trap data. With that, I'll take any questions you have in the Q&A.